Hello and welcome to this infection basics video. I'm Dr. Aled Roberts, and in this video we're going to look at microbial pathogenesis, so how organisms interact with a human host to cause infection and disease. Now before we begin, it's important to remember microorganisms were the first forms of life on Earth, and they have since spread to every corner of the planet. They inhabit environments that would be lethal to most other life forms, and they are also an unavoidable part of our daily existence. Microorganisms are present in the food we eat, the water we drink, and the air we breathe. And of course, they colonize our bodies both externally and internally. And so together, humans and their associated microorganisms form a sort of supraorganism that exists in a state of dynamic equilibrium. Now, the vast majority of these microbes are harmless, and many provide essential benefits to our health and physiology. However, a small proportion have the potential to cause harm. Now, one of the most common types of host microorganism relationships is that of commensalism. This is where one organism benefits from the relationship whilst the other is not affected in any meaningful way. And a classic example of this is the presence of Staphylococcus aureus on human skin. For this bacterium, the skin provides a stable environment with access to nutrients and warmth, allowing it to grow and persist. For the host, however, this relationship is largely neutral. Under normal conditions, its presence does not provide a benefit, but nor does it cause disease. Now, beyond commensalism, some host microorganism interactions are actively beneficial to both. This type of relationship is known as mutualism, where both organisms gain a clear advantage from being together. And a good example of this is the relationship between E. coli and the human gastrointestinal tract. Within the gut, E. coli benefits from a warm, nutrient-rich environment that supports its growth and survival. And in return, these bacteria possess enzymes that humans do not, allowing them to break down certain components of our diet, which we can then absorb and use. And finally, some host microbe interactions, and arguably the ones we are most interested in, are fundamentally harmful to the host. These relationships are parasitic, where one organism benefits at the direct expense of the other. And a clear example of this is infection with the influenza virus, where it invades cells lining the respiratory tract and hijacks the host cell's machinery to produce viral progeny. This replication process provides no benefit to the host cell and ultimately results in its destruction as the infected cell is lysed open when new viruses are released. And so at this point, it's important to distinguish between infection and disease. So in simple terms, infection describes the moment when the host and the pathogen meet. So when the pathogen successfully enters, attaches to, and grows within the host. And so this interaction does not automatically result in disease, but it creates the conditions under which diseases may develop. And so disease arises when this interaction leads to damage of host tissues, disruption of normal physiological functions, or the activation of host responses that themselves cause harm. And so the processes that link infection to the development of disease are collectively referred to as pathogenesis. And microbial pathogenesis follows a series of events that begin with infection and in some cases progress to disease. Okay, so let's look at the series of events under pathogenesis, and it starts with exposure, because before any infection can occur, a microorganism has to come into contact with the host, and so exposure can happen through a range of routes such as inhalation, ingestion, or direct contact with skin. Now importantly, exposure on its own does not mean infection or disease will follow. In many cases, the microorganism is removed by physical barriers like mucus and cilia, outcompeted by the normal microbiota, or cleared by the immune system. Whether exposure progresses further depends on factors such as the infectious dose, the virulence of the microorganism, and the susceptibility of the host. And so if exposure is successful, we move on to the first critical step of the infectious process, which is adherence. Now, for many microorganisms, attaching to host cells or tissues is essential because without attachment, they are easily removed by normal physiological processes. And this adherence is often highly specific, involving microbial surface structures known as adhesins binding to specific receptors on host cells. And it's these types of interactions that help explain why certain pathogens infect specific tissues or organs, a concept known as tissue tropism. Now, after successful adherence, some microorganisms remain on the surface of host tissues, whilst others go on to invade. And so this invasion step requires the ability of certain pathogens to cross epithelial barriers and enter deeper parts of tissues or even host cells. How they do this? Well, it may involve the production of enzymes that break down host structures or the manipulation of host cell processes to facilitate uptake. And so an invasive ability allows pathogens to access new niches within the host and can help them evade certain immune defenses. And with that, we start to enter the final phase of infection, where once established within a host, the organism starts to multiply and grow. Now, successful replication depends on the microorganism's ability to access nutrients, tolerate host conditions, and avoid or at least resist the host's immune response system. And as a microbial population increases, the likelihood of damage to the host also increases. Meaning for many infections, there is a direct relationship between microbial load and the severity of disease, with some exceptions of course. And so at this point, we move from infection to disease. And one way pathogens cause disease is through toxicity, which is the damage caused by microbial toxins or other harmful products. Now, these toxins can act locally at the site of infection or spread systemically through the body, causing effects elsewhere. And it's because of this, significant disease symptoms can occur even when the microorganism itself remains relatively localized. Now, a second major contributor to disease is invasiveness. Here, damage results from the physical spread of the microorganism through tissues or via the bloodstream. As pathogens invade new sites, they can directly damage cells and tissues. And it's not just that. The host's inflammatory and immune responses will contribute significantly to disease severity, sometimes causing more harm than the microorganism itself. However, this is by design of the microorganism. And so we arrive at the end game, damage. The clinical symptoms we associate with infections happen because of tissue or systemic damage as a result of a combination of microbial factors such as toxins and invasion, as well as host factors such as the immune response. And of course, the balance between the two determines disease severity and the overall outcome. So overall, microbial pathogenesis is a stepwise process that begins with exposure and progresses through infection and disease. But of course, whether disease occurs and how severe it becomes depends on the interaction between host and pathogen. And with that, we come to the end of this video. Hopefully you found the content useful, informative, and most importantly, easy to understand. Thanks for watching, and I hope you have a great day.